One of the reasons why I use capnography is to assess for respiratory depression. When I do seminars, I like to ask the audience, what are some signs and symptoms of respiratory depression? Well, they'll raise their hand and they'll say, respiratory rate. I'll say, what's the normal respiratory rate for an adult? They go 12 to 20. And I'll say, okay, if someone's breathing 4 times a minute, is that respiratory depression? And they go, yeah. And I'll say, on every patient breathing 4 times a minute? And they go, well, no. I said, well, then you can't use that. What's another one? Chest rise and fall. So they'll go down the list of all the things they've ever learned. And so I bring up to them, and I have this little saying I use, if someone loses their desire to live, they suffer from clinical depression. Now, how do they assess for that? They send in a screener to ask them questions. Are you too sad to live? You know, are you giving away your stuff? You know, they ask them questions like that. They ask them mnemonics like in sad cages, you know, little questions to ask people. If they meet a certain criteria, like in the questionnaire, then we diagnose them with clinical depression. Well, if you lose your stimulus to breathe, you have respiratory depression. And when you look at respiratory depression, we have to ask the question, WWMD, what would medulla do? Because CO2 is measured in your body, in the brain, with chemoreceptors. And the brain gets the message that CO2 levels are high, and when that happens, you breathe. And so the medulla is in charge of your breathing. It's measuring the CO2, not your respiratory rate, not your chest rise and fall, not your skin color. It's measuring your CO2 levels. And so if we're to have a clue as someone's breathing adequately, whether they're breathing adequately on their own, or whether we're doing it adequately by supplementing their ventilation, then we have to actually look at that. I mean, how can we get by thinking we're ventilating someone adequately if we're not measuring CO2? Another case is, for example, the heroin addict, someone who may have used drugs. You show up in an alleyway, you got a person with needle marks up their arms, they got the syringe right there, the narcotic still in the syringe, they got the heat source, everything's right there. And you show up and the person's laying there unconscious on the ground. A real quick check reveals they're breathing 4 times a minute. Okay, that's enough right there. But wait a minute, let's check their pupils. Their pupils are pinpoint. Okay, that's a sure sign of a narcotic overdose. So we give them Narcan. Why? Well, they're only breathing 4 times a minute. Why? Well, because it's protocol. Why? Well, they're in respiratory depression. Well, I asked, did you ask them? Excuse me, sir, are you too sad to breathe? And so the patient's not going to respond to you. And so, I mean, did you know that when a bear hibernates in the winter, it only takes 1 breath a minute? That's because its metabolism is so low that it only has to take 1 breath a minute. Well, narcotics do the same thing. They depress metabolism. You know, if you don't consume oxygen, you don't produce CO2. And so maybe their medulla's got them. Did it ever occur to you that the guy in the alley might have induced recreational hibernation? You know, because that might be his problem right there. And so for us to give someone a dose of Narcan and wake them up and risk injury or a disease or something like that is ridiculous. If it's a narcotic overdose, they will die because of respiratory depression. We have mechanical ways to ventilate someone to make sure they don't do that. And besides, we're not a toxicologist either. You know, I mean, there's a case, well-known case of a famous actor named River Phoenix. He died after he was given Narcan of a suspected narcotic overdose, but he actually had a mixed overdose of methamphetamines and narcotics. And when the Narcan reversed to narcotic, the methamphetamine kicked in and caused him to go into arrest, and they couldn't get him back. And this was a case where if we could just measure his ventilation and see that it was normal, then we can just lay him on his side, protect his airway, and take him to the hospital where they can do a tox screen on him. Again, life is air going in and out, blood going round and round. Our goal is to make sure the ABC stay stable. With the assessment tool that capnography offers, we can triage somebody's airway, breathing, and circulatory status right there on the scene initially, and then we can go forward from there and see what we actually have to do, instead of just following protocols based upon presenting signs and symptoms.